The auction was already over before it started. That is the part nobody talks about. By the time 61 people filed into the Harlan County sale barn on the morning of September 9th, 1983, the outcome had already been decided, or so they believed. The farm was going under. The debts were real. The bank had a number in mind, and the dealers who had driven 2 and 3 hours to get there had numbers of their own. Everyone in that room understood what was about to happen to 340 acres of Harlan County, Nebraska land that had been in the Hargrove family for 41 years. What none of them knew, not the dealers, not the estate attorney seated at the side table, not the auctioneer adjusting his microphone at the front, was that the boy sitting in the third row already owned it. His name was Daniel Roy Hargrove. He was 19 years old. He had driven to the sale barn that morning in a truck with 214,000 miles on it, wearing the same canvas coat he wore to fix fence because it was the only coat he owned. He had no lawyer with him. He had no advisor. He had a folded piece of paper in his breast pocket and a decision he had made 3 weeks earlier that no one in that room was going to find out about until the moment he chose to tell them. The auctioneer called the room to order at 9 o'clock. The first lot, the equipment, the machinery, the lifetime of tools and implements that Daniel's father had accumulated across 30 years of farming went up for bid. The room was loud with the confidence of people who had done their research and believed they understood exactly what was for sale. 37 minutes later, the room went silent. But before we get to that morning, before we get to the silence, you need to understand who Daniel Hargrove was before he walked into that sale barn. Because what he did in that room was not accidental. It was not lucky. It was the result of a very specific kind of upbringing applied to a very specific kind of crisis by a young man who had been prepared for exactly this moment by a father who never once said out loud that he was preparing him. Walter Burrell Hargrove was not a man who explained himself. He was a farmer in this plainest sense of the word, methodical, patient, attentive to the thousand small signals that land and livestock give before anything goes wrong. He had the knack that serious farmers develop over decades of close observation, the ability to know what something needed before it showed visible signs of needing it. He applied this to his cattle, he applied it to his soil, and he applied it with the same quiet deliberateness to his son. But there was something beneath the farming, beneath the patience in the early mornings, in the economy of words, something Walter carried that almost no one in Harlan County knew about. A wound, old enough to have scarred over but never fully healed. The kind of wound that changes the way a man thinks about everything that matters to him. It happened in 1962. Walter was 28 years old that year, newly married to Ruth Elaine, farming 160 acres of ground that his own father had broken from native grass 20 years earlier. He was not wealthy, but he was stable, and the land was his, or so he believed. A boundary dispute with a neighboring property had been simmering for 2 years, quiet and manageable, until a bank holding a note on the adjacent parcel decided to move on a foreclosure and reclassify the contested strip of ground as part of their collateral. Walter showed up in the county courthouse with everything he had: the deed, the survey, 20 years of family farming on that land. He sat across from a bank attorney and a judge and laid everything on the table. He was missing one document, a recorded easement agreement from 1948 that would have established his family's historical claim to the strip beyond dispute. His father had signed it. The county had filed it. But Walter had never known it existed, and in the chaos of his father's death 2 years earlier, the original had been lost in a box of papers that had never been properly sorted. 40 acres. Gone. Not stolen. Not taken by dishonest men. Taken by the machinery of a system that operated on documents and that moved forward with complete indifference to the truth of who had actually farmed that ground for 20 years. Because the truth of who farmed the ground was not in the file. Walter drove home that day and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Ruth said later, much later years after Walter was gone, that it was the only time in their marriage she had seen him cry. Not loudly, just sitting there with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing. He never talked about it again. But he never forgot what it had taught him. A piece of paper properly filed, properly recorded in the right place at the right time was worth more than 20 years of honest farming. The system did not care about your history. It cared about your documentation. And if you did not control your documentation, you did not control your land. From that year forward, Walter Hargrove read the Nebraska property law statutes the way other men read the Bible, not for comfort, but for understanding. He kept a document box made of oak that his father had built, and he maintained it with the same precision he maintained his equipment. Every deed, every note, every recorded agreement, filed in order, cross-referenced, updated whenever anything changed. He did not think of this as unusual. He thought of it as farming. Daniel Roy Hargrove was born in 1964, the only child of Walter and Ruth. He grew up on 340 acres of Harlan County ground, 200 acres of winter wheat in the Northfields, 140 acres of rougher pasture land in the south, running a cow-calf operation, the whole place threaded together by fence lines and habit, and the particular silence of a farm that is always in the middle of something. Walter began taking Daniel along on everything when the boy was 7 years old. Not as a helper. As a student, though, Walter would never have used that word. Daniel rode the tractor before his legs were long enough to reach the pedals properly. He ran fence with his father on cold October mornings, learning to read the wire the way Walter read it by sound and tension, and the particular way it behaved in cold weather versus warm. He sat in the cab during wheat harvest and watched his father manage the machine with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who understood that one wrong adjustment could cost an hour and one missed signal could cost the whole day. By the time Daniel was 12, he was doing things that teenage farmhands were paid to do on neighboring operations. By 14, Walter trusted him with the cattle management alone for stretches of 2 weeks when other work demanded his attention elsewhere. There was a quality to Daniel that Walter recognized and cultivated without naming it. The boy was quiet in groups, not shy, not withdrawn, but observant in a way that went beyond what most children managed. He listened with his whole attention. He remembered what he was shown, not because he had any extraordinary gift of memory, but because he paid attention the first time in a way that made repetition unnecessary. He was calm in situations that produced anxiety in other people, not because he was indifferent to outcomes, but because he had learned by watching Walter that anxiety was expensive, and that clarity was almost always available to the person willing to sit still long enough to find it. These were not lessons Walter taught with words. They were lessons that moved between them in the way that things move between fathers and sons who spend long hours together in silence, absorbed rather than explained, understood without being stated. In 1979, Walter Hargrove was diagnosed with a heart condition serious enough to take him out of heavy field work for 2 full seasons. Daniel was 15 years old. He took over the farm operations the way water takes over a low place naturally without announcement, because there was no other option and he already knew what to do. He managed a full wheat harvest in 1979. He ran the calving season in the early months of 1980 without losing a single calf to weather or complication. He rebuilt a section of fence along the south pasture boundary that Walter had been planning to replace for 2 years, doing it properly, setting posts at the right depth, stretching wire to the right tension, finishing the corners the way Walter had shown him. He did all of this without being asked to do more than he was doing, without complaining about what it cost him, and without making it into a story about himself. It was simply what needed doing, and he was the one who could do it, and so he did it. Ruth watched her son move through those 2 years with an attention that was not quite worry and not quite pride, but something that sat between the two. She was a farmer's daughter herself, raised on a wheat operation in the Nebraska Panhandle by a father who believed that land and silence were the 2 most important things a person could inherit. She understood the code that Daniel was living by because she had grown up inside a version of the same code. She cooked, she kept the house, she managed the household accounts with the precision of someone who understood exactly how thin the margins were and exactly how much a single bad season could change. She did not interfere with the arrangement between Walter and Daniel because she understood that it was not an arrangement in any ordinary sense. It was a transmission. Walter was transmitting something to his son that could only be transmitted this way, through shared work, shared silence, shared early mornings, in cold weather, doing things that mattered. She trusted it, even when it cost her boy something. Walter recovered enough to return to lighter work by 1981. He and Daniel farmed together for 2 seasons, 1981 and 1982, that were by any measure the best the Hargrove operation had ever produced. The wheat yields in those 2 years were the highest the Northfields had ever returned. The cow-calf herd was at its largest and most productive. The equipment was in good repair. The fences were tight. The farm felt in those 2 years like a thing that had found its right gear, every system running, at the level it was designed to run, at the whole operation, moving with the smooth efficiency that only comes when the people doing the work understand it completely. Daniel had begun in the fall of 1982, attending the agricultural program at the State College 60 miles east part-time, fitting the coursework around the farm schedule, the way he fit everything around the farm schedule, with the practical intelligence of someone who understood that the farm was not an interruption to his life, but the foundation of it. He was interested in the coursework. He was good at it. His instructors noted that he asked questions that suggested he had already thought carefully about the subject before the class began. He was doing what Walter had always hoped he would do, taking the knowledge of the land and matching it to the formal knowledge of the institution building, something more complete than either alone could offer. Then in March of 1983, Walter Hargrove had a second cardiac event. This one was not something he recovered from. Daniel came home from the college program when the call came. He did not go back. He was 18 years old. He was suddenly the only Hargrove on 340 acres of Nebraska ground. And he was suddenly the executor in practice, if not yet in law, of a situation that was considerably more complicated than anything his agricultural coursework had addressed. The debts were the first thing he had to understand. The farm carried a land note of $91,000, the remainder of a loan Walter had taken in 1975 to purchase an additional 80-acre parcel adjacent to the North wheat fields. The purchase had made sense in 1975, when input costs and land values seemed to be moving in a direction that rewarded expansion. It made less sense as interest rates climbed through the late 1970s and grain prices did not climb with them. There were also operating lines of credit accumulated over 4 consecutive seasons of tight margins, totaling $57,000. The estate attorney, a man named Preston Orville from the county seat, had been engaged by the bank to manage the settlement. He was not a dishonest man. He was a thorough man who specialized in estate resolution and who in the spring and summer of 1983 was managing 9 open estate files simultaneously. He reviewed the Hargrove file with the efficiency that 9 simultaneous files requires. He saw the debt figure. He saw the assets. He calculated the path to resolution. He recommended liquidation. He had not read every document in the file. Daniel sat across from Preston Orville in the estate attorney's office 3 weeks after Walter's death and listened to the man explain with genuine care and professional clarity what was going to happen to everything his family had built. The land, the equipment, the cattle, all of it sold at auction, the proceeds applied to the debt, the remainder, if there was a remainder, returned to the estate. Daniel listened. He asked 2 questions. He thanked the man for his time. He drove home. There was a second number that Preston Orville's file did not contain. 3 days after the estate meeting, going through Walter's desk in the farmhouse office, Daniel found a loan document he had never seen before. A note from a credit union in a town 40 miles away, dated September 1981, the same month Daniel had started the agricultural program. $23,000. The terms were straightforward. The purpose listed in Walter's careful handwriting on the copy he had kept was equally straightforward. College expenses, agricultural program, Dr. Hargrove. Walter had borrowed $23,000 to pay for his son's education without telling anyone. Not Daniel, not Ruth. He had taken on the debt in silence, added it to everything else he was carrying, and had never once mentioned it. Daniel sat with that document for a long time. The total debt was not $148,000 as Preston Orville's file showed. It was $171,000, and a significant portion of it existed because Walter Hargrove had decided without discussion that his son's future was worth borrowing against, even when the borrowing was hard. Daniel set the loan document on the desk. He did not call Preston Orville to report the additional debt. He did not call Ruth into the office to show her what he had found. He sat with the number and what it meant for a long time, and then he went out to the barn and worked until the light was gone, because that was the only thing that made sense to do. It was 3 weeks after Walter's death when Daniel found the oak document box. He had been sorting through the farmhouse, a process that moved slowly because every drawer and shelf and closet contained not just objects, but evidence of a life that had been built over decades with enormous deliberateness, and because Daniel was not a person who moved through things without paying attention to them. The document box was on the shelf in the farmhouse office where it had always been. Daniel had seen it his entire life. He had never opened it because it was Walter's, and what was Walter's did not require explanation or investigation. It simply was. He opened it now. The contents were organized exactly as Walter had organized everything, with the patient precision of a man who understood that documents were tools, and that tools needed to be where you could find them when you needed them. The original 1942 deed his grandfather's filing was at the front. Behind it, a survey from 1958. Behind that, the 1971 paid-off receipt the year the farm had been completely clear of debt, before the expansion loan of 1975 changed that. Behind that, the expansion loan itself and its subsequent refinancing records. And then near the back of the box, under a stack of equipment warranties and crop insurance records that Daniel moved carefully to one side, there was an envelope. White, letter-sized, sealed. On the front, in Walter's handwriting, the same careful, upright script that had appeared on every document in the box, on every check Daniel had ever seen his father write on the loan note for $23,000, that was still sitting on the desk in the next room, was a single word: Daniel. He stood in the farmhouse office with the envelope in his hands for a long moment. The house was quiet. It was mid-morning, and the kind of Nebraska morning in June when the light comes in flat, and even through windows that face north, and everything is very still. He opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document, 4 pages, typed on the letterhead of a law office in a town 30 miles from Harlan County, dated November 22nd, 1978. It took Daniel several minutes to read it through the first time, because the language was precise and technical and required the kind of careful attention that Walter had spent 15 years teaching his son to give to things that mattered. He read it a second time, more slowly. What the document described was a deed transfer, a joint tenancy arrangement. Walter Hargrove, as the sole owner of 340 acres of Harlan County, Nebraska farmland, transferring co-ownership of that land to Daniel Roy Hargrove as joint tenant with right of survivorship, which meant, under Nebraska property law, that upon Walter's death, Daniel's ownership of the land did not pass through the estate. It had already transferred by operation of law at the moment of Walter's death to Daniel as the surviving joint tenant. Daniel set the document down on the desk. He picked it up again. He read the third page, which contained the recording information. A notation in the handwriting of the law office indicating that the document had been submitted for recording at the Harlan County Courthouse on November 22nd, 1978. November 22nd, 1978, Daniel's 14th birthday. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up, put the document back in the envelope, put the envelope in the inside pocket of his work jacket, and drove to the Harlan County Courthouse. The clerk at the land records desk was a woman who had worked in that office for 11 years. She pulled the recording index for November 1978, ran her finger down the page, and stopped. Walter Burrell Hargrove to Daniel Roy Hargrove. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. 340 acres. Recorded November 22nd, 1978. Book and page number listed clearly. The document was there. It had been there for nearly 5 years. It was valid. It was properly recorded. It was exactly what it said it was. Daniel thanked the clerk. He drove home. He did not call Preston Orville. He did not call Ruth into the kitchen to explain what he had found. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought carefully about what he was holding and what it meant, and most importantly, what the right moment would be to use it. He was 18 years old. He had no legal training. He had the document his father had left him, the courthouse confirmation that it was valid, and the instinct, the particular inherited instinct of a man raised by Walter Hargrove, that the most important thing he could do right now was not move too fast. The institutions were moving. Preston Orville was working through his file. The bank was preparing its position. The auction company would be engaged soon. All of it was moving with the speed and certainty of machinery that had already decided what it was doing. Daniel had something the machinery did not know about. He was going to be patient. He was going to watch. And he was going to wait for exactly the right moment. Outside the kitchen window, the north field stretched away toward the horizon. The June wheat standing at mid-height in the flat Nebraska, light green and steady, and entirely indifferent to the question of who owned the ground it was growing from. Walter had answered that question 5 years ago. He had answered it in silence on a Tuesday in November at a law office 30 miles from home, and he had put the answer in an envelope with his son's name on it and filed it in the one place he knew his son would eventually look. The land was Daniel's. It had been Daniel's since March. It had been on its way to being Daniel's since November of 1978, the year Daniel turned 14 and Walter Hargrove drove to a law office without explanation and made an arrangement that no one, including his son, would understand the full significance of for another 5 years. Daniel finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He went out to check the fence line along the south pasture because it needed checking, and because there was work to do, and because Daniel Roy Hargrove was his father's son, and his father's son did not stop working just because the world had become complicated. The work was how you got through. The work was always how you got through. He had 3 months until the auction. He had a document in an envelope. He had a father who had understood something about the future that he had never said out loud. And he had learned from that same father that the thing you know and the moment you choose to use it are two entirely different decisions, and that the second one matters just as much as the first. There is a particular kind of patience that has nothing to do with stillness. It is not the patience of a man sitting on a porch watching the afternoon go by. It is not the patience of someone who has accepted that nothing can be done. It is the patience of a person who knows exactly what is coming, who has seen the whole shape of the thing clearly, and who understands that the moment he acts matters as much as the action itself. Daniel Hargrove spent the summer of 1983 practicing that kind of patience. He attended every meeting Preston Orville scheduled. He sat across from the estate attorney in the man's wood-paneled office at the county seat and listened to the progress reports with the composed attention of someone who had no particular stake in the proceedings. He answered every question he was asked. He did not volunteer information that had not been requested. He signed what needed to be signed. He nodded when nodding was appropriate. Preston Orville was a careful man doing careful work, and he genuinely believed he was serving the Hargrove estate to the best of his ability. Daniel could see that clearly. The man was not an adversary. He was a professional operating within a system, working from the documents that system had given him, moving toward the conclusion that those documents made inevitable. He simply did not have all the documents. And Daniel was not going to tell him that. Not yet. Not in a quiet office at the county seat with no witnesses and no moment. When the information came out, and it was going to come out because Daniel had decided it was going to come out on his terms, in his time, in the one place where it would mean the most it needed to come out the right way. Walter had spent 20 years preparing a document. The least his son could do was spend a summer preparing the moment. The inventory of the farm's assets took 3 weeks in June. A man from the auction company arrived with a clipboard and walked every building, every lot, every piece of ground with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had done this 100 times before. He cataloged the wheat drill, the tractor, the older grain truck, the post-hole digger, the cattle handling equipment, the irrigation fittings, the stored fence materials stacked along the south wall of the equipment shed. He counted the cattle, recorded their weights and approximate values, noted the condition of the herd with the detached professionalism of a man for whom these animals were line items rather than the product of 30 years of careful breeding. Daniel walked with him through every building. He answered every question about the equipment with complete accuracy. He knew everything about everything on that farm, what it was worth, what it cost to maintain, how many hours were on every engine, which pieces had been rebuilt, and which were original. He had absorbed this knowledge the way he had absorbed everything Walter taught him, not through instruction, but through proximity, through years of shared mornings and shared work, and the particular education that comes from doing something difficult alongside someone who does it well. The auction company man wrote down the numbers Daniel gave him without question. Daniel's knowledge was obvious, and his manner was calm, and there was nothing about him that suggested he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a young man doing the hard work of settling his father's estate with as much grace as 19 years old could manage. He was also in the privacy of his own thinking, cataloging something the auction company man was not. Every item on that clipboard was something Walter had built or bought or earned over 30 years. The wheat drill had been purchased in 1971, the year the farm was paid off, the same year Walter had sat at the kitchen table and written the final check on the original land note and kept a copy of the receipt the way other men kept photographs. The grain truck had been Walter's father's before it was Walter's. The post-hole digger had driven 10,000 fence posts into Nebraska hardpan across 4 decades of boundary maintenance. These things were going to be sold. Daniel understood that. The equipment was part of the estate in a way the land was not, and the equipment needed to go toward the debt, and that was simply the reality of the situation. He was not sentimental about it. Walter had not raised him to be sentimental about tools. But he paid attention to each item as the man cataloged it, because paying attention was what Walter had taught him to do, and because some part of him understood that this was the last time he was going to see these things as a complete collection. The working inventory of his father's working life, assembled over decades and about to be dispersed to other farms, other operations, other men who would put them to use without knowing anything about where they had come from. He paid attention the way Walter would have wanted him to pay attention, quietly, completely, and without making it into anything larger than what it was. In the first week of July, Preston Orville called. It was an ordinary call, the kind the estate attorney made regularly, to keep Daniel informed of progress. The creditor notifications had gone out, the auction date had been set for September 9th, the bank had confirmed its position on the outstanding debt. Standard procedure. The kind of call a careful professional makes to demonstrate that he is on top of things. And then near the end of the call, Preston Orville mentioned something that was not entirely routine. He said that in preparing the title documentation for the auction company, the standard package that would allow bidders to verify the clean transfer of title, he had pulled the county's recording index for the Hargrove parcels. A routine step, something he did on every estate file that involved real property. And in that index, he had found a notation. November 22nd, 1978. A recorded instrument. Walter Burrell Hargrove grantor. Daniel Roy Hargrove grantee. The document type listed in the index was a deed. Preston Orville's voice on the phone was careful and neutral in the way that careful, neutral men are when they have encountered something unexpected and are waiting to understand it before they react to it. He said he was sure it was probably a straightforward internal family matter, perhaps a preliminary arrangement Walter had made that had been superseded by later planning. But he wanted to ask Daniel about it directly so that the title package could be prepared accurately. Daniel was standing at the kitchen counter when the call came. He had been eating lunch, a sandwich standing up the way he usually ate when he was working, and he set the sandwich down and listened to Preston Orville finish his question. Then he said, "That's a family matter from a few years back. Some paperwork my father had put together. I'll bring everything I have to the auction, and we can sort it out there if it needs sorting." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Preston Orville said that would be fine. He said he would note it in the file. He said he appreciated Daniel's cooperation throughout the process, which was entirely genuine because Daniel had in fact been cooperative throughout the process in every way that the estate attorney could see. They said goodbye. Daniel hung up the phone. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Then he picked up his sandwich and finished it. He had just placed his entire strategy on a single sentence. Preston Orville had found the recording index entry. He had not found the document itself, or if he had found it, he had not yet understood what it meant. He had accepted Daniel's characterization of it as a family matter because Daniel's manner left no room for the suspicion that it was anything else. But the clock had moved. The attorney now knew the document existed. If he looked more carefully, if he pulled the full recorded deed, rather than just the index entry, if he consulted a property law specialist, if he spent an afternoon in the county records room working through the implications, he would arrive at the same conclusion. Daniel had arrived at standing in that courthouse in June. Daniel needed to move, not fast, carefully, but now. The following Tuesday, Daniel left the farm before 6 in the morning. He drove west on the state highway for 3 hours through the flat middle of Nebraska, through towns that appeared on the horizon as a water tower and a grain elevator, and then disappeared in the rearview mirror as the same two shapes going the other direction. He had the address written on a piece of paper on the passenger seat. He had the envelope from the document box on the seat beside it. Helen Marsh had an office above a hardware store on the main street of Grand Island. She had been practicing agricultural law in Nebraska for 24 years. The county extension agent who had known Walter Hargrove slightly and who had watched Daniel manage the farm through the previous 2 years with the respectful attention of someone who recognized competent farming when he saw it, had given Daniel her name the week before with a single sentence of endorsement. He said, "She is the one you call when the problem does not fit the ordinary categories." Daniel climbed the stairs above the hardware store and sat in the waiting area for 20 minutes. When Helen Marsh came out to meet him, she was a woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who had heard a great many unusual things and had learned to listen to all of them before forming an opinion. She took him into her office. He sat down across from her desk. He took the envelope out of his jacket, removed the deed transfer, and placed it on the desk in front of her without preamble. She read it. She asked him 2 questions. She asked whether he had confirmed the recording at the county courthouse personally, and he said he had in June, and he gave her the book and page number from memory. She wrote the number down. She asked whether anyone else, the estate attorney, the bank, anyone had seen the full document, and he said not yet as far as he knew. She looked at him across the desk for a moment. Then she said she would need 48 hours to review the recording and prepare a written opinion. She said her fee for that work would be $175. She said it in the straightforward manner of someone who understood that the young man sitting across from her was not wealthy and that the number needed to be stated plainly. Daniel said that was fine. He drove 3 hours back to Harlan County. He was home before dark. He went out and checked the cattle and walked the south fence line in the last of the evening light, the way Walter had always walked it when something needed thinking through. Not because the fence needed checking, but because moving through familiar ground at a measured pace was the best way Walter had ever found to think clearly. 48 hours later, Helen Marsh called. Her written opinion was 2 pages long and stated its conclusion in the first paragraph. The recorded joint tenancy deed of November 22, 1978, was valid under Nebraska property law. Upon Walter Hargrove's death, Daniel Roy Hargrove had become the sole owner of the 340 acres of Harlan County farmland by operation of the right of survivorship. The land was not and had not been an asset of the Walter Hargrove estate since the date of Walter's death in March 1983. She said she would mail the written opinion that afternoon. Daniel thanked her. He hung up the phone. He went back to work. The opinion arrived 2 days later in a plain envelope. Daniel read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the breast pocket of his canvas coat alongside the deed transfer and the courthouse recording confirmation. 3 documents, folded flat, fitting together in the pocket with the precision of things that belong together. He did not call Preston Orville. He did not contact the bank. He put the coat on its hook by the back door and went out to the north fields to check the wheat, which was coming along well in the August heat, steady and indifferent, the way wheat is always steady and indifferent. The auction was 33 days away. August moved the way August moves in Nebraska, slowly, hotly, with the particular weight of a season that has gone on long enough and not quite ended. The days were long and the evenings were still, and the farm continued its work with the mechanical regularity that farms maintain, regardless of what is happening to the people on them. Daniel worked. He worked the way Walter had worked from first light to last light, moving through the list of things that needed doing with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the work did not wait for circumstances to improve. He serviced the equipment that was going to be auctioned, because that was what you did with equipment. You maintained it properly until it was no longer yours to maintain, and you left it in the condition you would want to receive it. He made the necessary repairs on the south fence. He managed the herd through the heat. Ruth watched him. She was not a woman who intruded on her son's thinking. She had spent her entire adult life in close proximity to men who processed the difficult things internally, who worked through problems in the barn rather than at the kitchen table, who arrived at their conclusions in silence and presented them only when they were ready. She had married one such man and raised another. She understood the code, but she was also a mother, and she was watching her son carry something through that August that she could not see clearly enough to name. He was present, always present at meals in the evenings when she needed something done around the house. He was not distant or shut down. He was simply occupied in the particular way that a person is occupied when they are managing something internally that has not yet become speakable. She found the hardware store receipt on the kitchen counter one morning in early August. $175. Grand Island, a law office. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. She set it back down. That evening when Daniel came in from the field, she asked him about it. Directly the way Ruth Hargrove asked things without softening or approach, just the plain question. He told her the truth in the plainest way he could manage without telling her everything. He said he had been looking into some of his father's paperwork. He said he had consulted a lawyer to help him understand something he had found. He said he was handling it. Ruth looked at her son for a long moment. Then she turned back to what she was doing at the counter because she was Ruth Hargrove, and she knew when not to push, and she had always trusted that the Hargrove men handled the important things the way the important things needed to be handled. She did not ask again, but she watched him. All through August, she watched him with the particular attention of a woman who has raised a child from birth and can read the weather in his face the way a farmer reads the weather in the sky, not always knowing exactly what is coming, but certain that something is. There was a night in the third week of August when Daniel could not sleep. He had gone to bed at his usual time, had lain in the dark for an hour without his mind settling, and had finally gotten up and gone to the kitchen the way he sometimes did when sleep was not arriving, to sit with a glass of water and let the quietness of the house do whatever it could do. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark. His canvas coat was hanging on the hook by the back door, the three documents in its breast pocket folded flat. He did not get up to look at them. He had them memorized. The deed transfer, the courthouse recording confirmation with the book and page number he had given Helen Marsh from memory, the two-page legal opinion, its conclusions stated in the first paragraph. He sat and thought about his father. Not about the document specifically, about Walter. About the man who had driven to a law office in November of 1978, a Tuesday Daniel had calculated looking back at the calendar, and had done something that he never mentioned to anyone. Not to Ruth, not to Daniel, not to the estate attorney who would eventually be hired to resolve his affairs. He had done it and filed it and put the documentation in an envelope and placed the envelope in the oak document box under the equipment warranties and crop insurance records, where it would wait with the patience of a properly recorded document for the moment when it was needed. Daniel had been 14 years old on that Tuesday in November. He remembered the day vaguely. He remembered that his father had been gone most of the morning and had come back before lunch, smelling of town. The particular smell of a building with forced air heating and carpet. The smell that came off Walter's jacket on the rare occasions he went somewhere that required more than the farm. He remembered that Walter had not explained where he had been because Walter did not explain himself, and Daniel had not asked because Daniel had been raised not to ask questions that were not his to ask. He had not understood the significance of that morning for 5 years. He sat with it now, the full weight of what his father had done. Not just the legal mechanics of it, though those were extraordinary enough. The thinking behind it. The foresight. Walter had looked at the future the way he looked at everything, not with hope or fear, but with clear-eyed attention, and he had seen what might come. He had seen that farms in the late 1970s were operating in conditions that could go bad in ways that no amount of good farming could prevent. He had seen that his own health was not a certainty. He had seen that his son was the thing worth protecting, and that the best protection he could give him was not a wall, but a foundation, something built so quietly and so correctly that by the time anyone needed it, it had already been holding everything up for years. He had made the arrangement. He had filed it. He had put it where Daniel would find it. And then he had gone home and continued farming and had never said a word about it to anyone. Daniel sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then he heard a sound from down the hallway. Not quite a sound, more the absence of the particular silence that meant his mother was asleep. He sat still and listened. After a moment he heard it clearly. The quiet movement of someone in the kitchen, except that he was in the kitchen. He turned. Ruth was standing in the doorway in her robe. She had not turned the light on. She stood in the dark the way she always moved through the house at night, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knew every inch of the place she had lived in for 30 years. She looked at her son sitting at the kitchen table. He looked at his mother standing in the doorway. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ruth went to the counter and poured herself a glass of water the way she had done in this kitchen 10,000 times before, and she brought it to the table and sat down across from her son. They sat in the dark together. After a while, Ruth said, "Your father knew what he was doing." It was not a question. It was the statement of a woman who had been thinking about something for a long time and had arrived at a conclusion that did not require elaboration. Daniel looked at his mother across the table. He said, "Yes, he did." Ruth nodded once. She drank some of her water. She set the glass down. She did not ask what Walter had known or how he had known it or what was going to happen on September 9th. She was Ruth Hargrove, and she had spent her entire life understanding things without requiring them to be explained to her. She had found the receipt from Grand Island. She had watched her son through August. She had added what she knew to what she felt, and had arrived somewhere close enough to the truth. She trusted him, the way she had always trusted the Hargrove men to carry the important things, the way the important things needed to be carried. They sat at the kitchen table in the dark for another few minutes. Then Ruth got up, set her glass in the sink, and went back to bed. Daniel sat alone at the table. He looked at the canvas coat hanging on the hook by the back door for a moment. Then he got up, went to bed, and slept soundly for the first time in 3 weeks. The night before the auction, Daniel took the 3 documents out of the coat pocket and read them one final time. He sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light, the deed transfer in front of him, reading it with the attention he had given it the first time. Not because he needed to read it, because every word was already in his memory, but because he wanted to come to September 9th with the language absolutely fresh in his mind. When he spoke in that room, he was going to speak precisely. He was going to use the exact language of the document, the exact recording date, the exact legal framing. There was no room for approximation. He read the deed transfer. He read the courthouse recording confirmation. He read Helen Marsh's two-page opinion, its conclusion in the first paragraph, its supporting analysis laid out in the careful, specific language of someone who had practiced Nebraska property law for 24 years and who knew precisely how to say a thing so that it could not be misunderstood. He folded all three documents back to their original creases. He placed them together, the deed transfer on top, the opinion on the bottom, the courthouse confirmation between them. He slid them into the breast pocket of the canvas coat. He turned off the kitchen light. He went out the back door and stood for a moment in the dark. The night was clear and warm the way Nebraska nights in early September can still be warm, with a sky full of stars going all the way to the horizon in every direction. The north fields were invisible in the dark, but he knew them without seeing them, knew the way the ground rose slightly about 200 yards north of the house, knew the way. The wheat rows ran east to west, knew the sound the wind made moving through the heads of grain at this stage of the season. He stood for a while. He was 19 years old. He was standing on 340 acres of ground that had been in his family for 41 years. Tomorrow morning, 61 people were going to file into the Harlan County sale barn and believe with complete certainty that they were going to watch that ground change hands. Walter Hargrove had made sure they were wrong about that 5 years ago. All Daniel had to do was go into the room and say so at the right moment. He went back inside. He set his alarm. He was asleep within minutes. The morning of September 9th, 1983 arrived, the way consequential mornings often do without any particular announcement, without weather that matched the occasion, without any signal that the day was going to be different from the ones before it. The sky over Harlan County was flat and pale. At first light, the kind of early September sky that carries the memory of summer without committing to anything. Daniel was up before 5. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the north fields in the gray pre-dawn light, the wheat stubble from the August harvest running in pale rows to the horizon. He had not planted this year's crop yet. There had been too much to manage with the estate proceedings, too many meetings and documents and arrangements requiring his attention in town. The planting would come later in the fall when the situation was resolved, and he knew what he was planting into what future the ground was going to hold. He finished his coffee, he washed the cup, he put on the canvas coat. The three documents were in the breast pocket where he had placed them the night before. He pressed his hand flat against the outside of the coat for a moment, feeling the slight stiffness of the folded papers beneath the canvas. Then he went out to his truck and drove to the sale barn. The Harlan County sale barn sat at the edge of town on a flat piece of ground that had been used for livestock sales and farm auctions for 30 years. It was a functional building, metal roof, concrete floor, rows of metal folding chairs facing the auctioneer's platform at the front, and it smelled the way sale barns always smell of coffee from the urn near the back wall, and the particular mixture of dust and machinery oil and human proximity that accumulates in a room where serious transactions have been conducted for a long time. Daniel arrived 20 minutes before registration opened. He parked his truck at the far edge of the lot and walked in through the side entrance, poured himself a cup of coffee from the urn, and took a seat in the third row near the center of the room. Not at the back where he might be overlooked. Not at the front where he would be scrutinized. The third row center where he could see everything in front of him and sense everything behind him, and where his presence registered as simply another person who had shown up to attend a farm auction. He set his coffee on the empty chair beside him. He watched the room fill. They came in the way they always came to these things, dealers in pairs and threes, talking among themselves with the relaxed confidence of professionals operating in familiar territory. Land investors from Lincoln and Omaha, in cleaner clothes than the farmers, carrying pad folios and speaking quietly on the phone before taking their seats. Local men who had driven 20 minutes rather than 2 hours, who knew the Hargrove ground from years of neighboring it, who had come with specific ideas about specific parcels. 61 registered bidders, a handful of observers, the auction company staff moving through the rows distributing the lot sheets, the itemized inventory of everything available for sale, organized by lot number, with estimated values printed beside each entry. Lot 14 at the bottom of the page, 340 acres Harlan County farmland. Legal description provided. Opening bid $240,000. Daniel did not look at his lot sheet when he received it. He folded it once and held it in his left hand without reading it, because he had no need to read it, and because the particular calm of someone who already knows the answer is partly maintained by not performing interest in the question. Preston Orville arrived and took his place at the side table. He was a composed man in his 50s, dark suit, briefcase open on the table beside him, his file organized in the methodical way he organized everything. He glanced toward Daniel when he sat down, gave a brief acknowledging nod, and returned to his papers. Clyde Mettler from First Frontier Bank arrived 2 minutes later and took a seat in the fourth row. He had a notepad and a pen and the expression of a man who had attended many of these proceedings and understood his role in this one precisely. He was there to ensure that the proceeds from the sale were properly applied to the outstanding notes. He had a number, the total debt obligation, and he was there to watch the auction exceed it so that the file could be closed. Roy Tillman, the auctioneer, stepped up to the platform at 8:55. Roy Tillman had been calling farm auctions in Nebraska for 20 years. He was a large man with a voice that carried without effort and the particular ease of someone who understood exactly what a room needed from him at any given moment. He had called sales in rooms smaller than this one and larger. He had called sales where the outcome was complicated and sales where it was straightforward. He checked his microphone. He arranged his lot sheets. He looked out at the room with the comfortable authority of a man who was entirely at home. At 9 o'clock precisely, he called the room to order. The equipment went first the way it always does at these sales, the smaller lots establishing the rhythm and energy of the room before the primary lot anchors the day. Roy Tillman moved through the items with practiced efficiency. The wheat drill opened at $2,000 and sold at $2,400 to a dealer from the western part of the county who had examined it during the preview and liked the condition of the seed discs. The tractor went to a neighboring farmer who had wanted it for 3 years and had come prepared to pay fairly for it. The grain truck, Walter's father's truck before it was Walter's, though Roy Tillman did not know that, and the lot sheet did not say it went at $3,100 to a buyer from 2 counties over. The post hole digger went for $210. It had driven 10,000 fence posts into Nebraska hardpan. The man who bought it did not know that. He would drive his own thousands with it, and someday it would end up in another sale barn, and the story of where it had been before would be entirely gone. Daniel watched each lot go. He held his coffee cup in his right hand and the unread lot sheet in his left, and he watched with the settled attention of someone observing a process he understands completely. Each piece of equipment that passed through the room was a thing he could have described in detail, its history, its maintenance record, its particular tendencies and quirks. None of that was relevant to the sale. The room was interested in the condition and the price. Daniel was the only person in it who was also interested in the history. He let the history go. One lot at a time, he let it go. Ruth was in the room. He had not known she was coming. She had not told him she planned to attend. But when he turned slightly in his seat 40 minutes into the equipment lots, he saw her sitting in the last row near the right wall, wearing the dark blue coat she wore to town, her hands folded in her lap. She was not looking at the auctioneer. She was looking at the room. Their eyes met briefly. Ruth gave him nothing, no nod, no expression, no signal of any kind. She simply looked at him for a moment with the calm, measuring attention she had given him his entire life, and then looked back at the room. She was there. That was all. She had decided to be present for whatever was going to happen, and she had made that decision on her own, and she had not asked Daniel whether that was all right, because it was not a question that required his permission. Daniel turned back to the front of the room. Roy Tillman was moving through the final equipment lots. The room's energy had the particular quality of a crowd that has completed a preliminary task and is now orienting itself toward the main event. Conversations that had paused for each lot were quieting further. The dealers who had come for equipment were settled now, their purchases secured, their attention drifting toward the door or toward the lot sheet item at the bottom of the page. The bidders who had come for the land were leaning slightly forward. Roy Tillman called the room to attention with the particular shift in his voice that auction crowds recognized the change from the working rhythm of routine lots to the deliberate formality of the primary lot. He read the legal description from the deed in front of him. 340 acres, Harlan County, Nebraska. The north 200 acres in winter wheat production, continuous since the early 1940s. The south 140 acres in mixed pasture seasonal draw reliable pond. The county assessor's valuation. The productive history of the ground. He noted that the land was offered as a single lot. He set the opening bid at $240,000. Three hands went up almost simultaneously. The bidding moved with the rapid overlapping rhythm of genuine competition. 240, 255, 262. A dealer from Omaha in the second row was bidding against a land investment representative seated near the sidewall and against a farmer 2 miles north of the Hargrove place, who had wanted the South pasture acreage for the better part of a decade and had come to September 9th prepared to make it happen. The room had changed. The dispersed energy of the equipment lots had focused into something concentrated and directional, the way light focuses when you pass it through glass. Every person in the room was oriented toward the platform, toward Roy Tillman, and the numbers he was calling, and the hands that were answering them. 268, 274. The neighboring farmer dropped out at 274,000, his limit reached, his face settling into the particular expression of a man who has decided he can live with the outcome, even though he wishes it were different. 279, 281. The investment company representative paused, not dropping out, but checking, turning to the colleague seated beside him with a murmured question that required a murmured answer. The Omaha dealer bid $283,000. The investment representative was still consulting. Roy Tillman held the rhythm the way experienced auctioneers hold it, the practiced pause that gives the hesitating bidder exactly enough space to re-enter without giving them so much space that the room's momentum dissipates. It was in that pause in the 4 or 5 seconds of suspended competition while the investment representative finished his consultation and prepared to raise his hand that Daniel Hargrove stood up. He did not raise a bidder's card. He did not raise his hand. He stood up from his folding chair in the third row, straightened to his full height in the canvas coat, and said in a voice that was not loud, but that carried across the entire room without any particular effort, the way voices carry in rooms that are waiting for something. I need to stop this lot. This land is not part of the estate. The room did not go quiet immediately. Rooms never do. There was a half-second of confusion, the particular cognitive delay of a crowd that has heard something that does not fit the frame it is operating inside. Then the murmuring began, the low-level sound of 61 people processing the same unexpected input at slightly different speeds. Roy Tillman held his gavel and looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who has called a great many auctions and has seen a great many things interrupt them, and is now determining with professional swiftness which category of interruption this one belongs to. He said, "Son, we're in the middle of a live lot." Daniel said, "I understand that. My name is Daniel Hargrove. Walter Hargrove was my father. This land was transferred to my name by joint tenancy deed in November of 1978, recorded at the Harlan County Courthouse. My father's death transferred full title to me by right of survivorship. The land has not been part of this estate since March of this year." He paused for one beat. "I have the deed, the courthouse recording confirmation, and a written legal opinion verifying all of this. I'd like to show them to Mr. Orville now." The murmuring stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way sound stops in a room when something has happened that every person present understands requires silence. Not commanded silence, not polite silence, but the involuntary quiet of a large group of people who have simultaneously understood that the situation they are inside has just become something other than what they believed it was. The Omaha dealer had his bidder's card in his hand. He set it on his knee. The investment representative had been about to raise his hand. He lowered it. Clyde Mettler from First Frontier Bank put his pen down on his notepad with the careful deliberateness of a man setting something down because his hands need to be free to do something else, though he did not yet know what that something else was going to be. Roy Tillman set his gavel on the platform. He looked at Daniel for a moment, then he looked at Preston Orville. Preston Orville was already standing. The walk from the third row to the auctioneer's platform was perhaps 30 feet. Daniel walked it with the unhurried steadiness that Walter had moved through everything, not performing calm, but actually calm, because he had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, and the moment was now exactly what he had prepared for. He reached the platform. He reached into the breast pocket of the canvas coat. He removed the 3 folded documents, the deed transfer on top, the courthouse recording confirmation, In the middle, Helen Marsh's two-page legal opinion on the bottom, and he placed them on the auctioneer's table. He stepped back. Preston Orville stepped forward. The estate attorney picked up the documents with the careful handling of someone who understood that he was picking up something consequential. He unfolded the deed transfer first. He read it, not skimmed it, read it the way a careful man reads a legal document when the stakes are clear. The room waited. It was the particular suspended animation of 61 people who had arrived with a complete and confident understanding of what the day was going to contain, and who were now sitting inside a 40-foot silence, while a man in a dark suit read a piece of paper that appeared to be revising that understanding entirely. The neighboring farmer, who had dropped out at 274,000, sat very still in his chair. He was a practical man who had spent his adult life reading situations accurately, and what he was reading right now in Daniel's bearing, in Preston Orville's expression as he moved from the first document to the second, was telling him something that he was not entirely surprised to hear. The Omaha dealer leaned toward the man beside him and said something in a low voice. The man beside him shook his head slightly without looking away from the front of the room. Clyde Mettler had picked up his pen again. He was not writing notes. He was holding the pen the way people hold objects when their hands need something to do, while their mind is doing something else. Ruth Hargrove sat in the last row near the right wall with her hands folded in her lap and watched her son stand at the front of the room. She could not see his face from where she sat. She could see his back, the canvas coat, the particular straightness of his posture, the posture Walter had stood with, the same shoulders, the same stillness. She had not yet seen the documents. She did not yet know precisely what was in them, but she had sat at a kitchen table in the dark 3 weeks earlier with her son and had heard him say 3 words that had been enough. Yes, he did. She had trusted those 3 words. She was trusting them now, sitting in the last row of the Harlan County sale barn, watching a room full of people wait for her son's father to be proven right about something he had arranged 5 years before his death. Preston Orville finished reading the courthouse recording confirmation. He moved to Helen Marsh's legal opinion. He read the first paragraph. He read the second. He turned the page and read the back. He looked up. 4 minutes had passed since Daniel had placed the documents on the table. The expression on Preston Orville's face was not shock. It was not denial. It was not the expression of a man trying to find a way around what he had just read. It was the expression that accurate information produces in careful people, a specific, quiet recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has understood something new and is already thinking about what it requires of him. He had worked from the documents in the estate file. The document that changed everything had not been in the estate file. It had been in a white envelope in an oak document box in a farmhouse under a stack of equipment warranties and crop insurance records, waiting with the patient certainty of a properly recorded instrument for the day it would be needed. He had not found it because it was not where he had looked. That was the entirety of the failure, and it was not a failure of character but of process. And Preston Orville was already in the 4 seconds between understanding what he had read and opening his mouth to speak, deciding what the correction to that process would be. He turned to Roy Tillman. He said, "We need to suspend this lot. I need to make some calls." Roy Tillman nodded once with the composure of a man who has handled unusual situations by doing the ordinary work of keeping the event moving forward. He picked up his microphone. He announced to the room that Lot 14 was being temporarily suspended pending a title matter, and that the sale would continue with the remaining lots while the matter was resolved. Then he moved to the next item on his sheet and called it without pause, because that was his job, and he understood his job, and because a room of 61 people in suspension needed something to do while the larger question was being answered. Daniel returned to his seat in the 3rd row. He picked up his coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold sometime during the equipment lots, but he drank some of it anyway because it was something to do with his hands, and because he was 19 years old and he had just done the most consequential thing he had ever done, and his hands wanted something to hold. Preston Orville was in the back office for 41 minutes. During that time, Roy Tillman sold 14 more small equipment lots. Each one went for slightly less than it might have under normal auction energy because the room's attention was not fully in the room. It was in the back office with the estate attorney and the phone calls he was making and the question that was sitting over the entire proceeding like a weather system that had not yet decided what it was going to do. The Omaha dealer sat with his arms crossed and his bidder's card on his knee and stared at the middle distance. The investment representative had his phone out, but was not using it, holding it the way Clyde Metler was holding his pen, because his hands needed something and his mind was elsewhere. The neighboring farmer sat with his lot sheet folded on his thigh and looked at the back wall of the sale barn. He was thinking about the south pasture. He had been thinking about those 140 acres for 9 years. He was doing the arithmetic of a man recalculating a situation that has changed in ways he did not anticipate. Ruth had not moved from the last row. She sat with the same stillness she had maintained since she arrived, watching the room the way she had watched her son through August. Not with alarm, but with the focused attention of a woman waiting for something she already partially understood to become fully clear. At 11:14 in the morning, Preston Orville came back through the door from the back office. He walked to the front of the room. He waited for Roy Tillman to complete the current lot. Then he stepped to the microphone with the professional composure of a man who has delivered difficult information before and understands that the way you deliver it matters as much as what you say. He said that he had spent the past 40 minutes confirming the title matter that had been raised regarding Lot 14. He said that the joint tenancy deed of November 22, 1978 was a valid recorded instrument under Nebraska property law. He said that upon Walter Hargrove's death in March of 1983, title to the 340 acres had transferred by right of survivorship to Daniel Roy Hargrove as the surviving joint tenant. He said that the land was not and had not been an asset of the Walter Hargrove estate. He said that Lot 14 was being withdrawn from the sale. He said it in plain language without qualification, the way accurate information should be delivered completely directly, and without leaving room for the conclusion to be anything other than what it was. The room received this in silence, not the stunned silence of people who cannot process what they have heard. The particular silence of a large group of people who have processed it fully and are now sitting inside the adjustment. The dealers were recalculating. The investors were recalculating. Clyde Metler from First Frontier Bank had his notepad open and was writing rapidly, not notes but a list of calls he needed to make the moment he was back in his car. Because the file he had come to this room to close was not going to close the way he had expected it to close. Roy Tillman moved the auction forward. The remaining lots were smaller, and they moved quickly, and by 12:40 the gavel came down on the last item, and the Harlan County sale barn began the process of dispersing. The equipment and livestock proceeds totaled $38,720, a meaningful reduction of the debt load, but far short of the $171,000 total outstanding. The estate would need to negotiate the remaining balance with First Frontier Bank based on whatever the new reality of the situation made possible. The new reality of the situation was that the bank held notes against a piece of ground they had no legal claim to. That was a different conversation than the one Clyde Metler had driven to Harlan County to have. Daniel stayed for the entire auction. He stayed the way Walter would have stayed through the end, through the last lot, through the closing of the books, because leaving before a thing was finished was not how the Hargroves did things. When the room began to clear, he stood and folded the lot sheet that he had held unread in his hand for 3 hours and placed it in his coat pocket. He walked to the front of the room and extended his hand to Preston Orville. Preston Orville shook it. He looked at Daniel for a moment with an expression that carried something beyond the professional acknowledgement of a resolved matter. He said that he would be in touch about next steps. He said it in the manner of a man who was already thinking about what those next steps were, and who understood that the ground had shifted beneath the entire proceedings in a way that required careful, deliberate navigation. Daniel nodded. He acknowledged Clyde Metler with the same brief, respectful nod he would have given any man in a professional capacity. Then he walked out of the sale barn into the flat September light. Ruth was waiting outside. She had come out ahead of the crowd the way she did things quietly without making a moment of the departure. She was standing near the edge of the building in her dark blue coat, not at the truck, just standing, looking out at the flat ground beyond the parking lot. Daniel walked to her. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at her son. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the folded photocopy of the deed transfer that Daniel had given her inside the copy he had made for her at the courthouse. The one he had placed in her hand during the suspension of Lot 14, without explanation, simply putting it in her hands because she was there, and she was his mother, and the information belonged to her. She had read it during Preston Orville's 41 minutes in the back office. She had read the date November 22, 1978. She had held that date in her mind for 41 minutes, and had understood slowly and completely what it meant. The year Daniel had turned 14. The Tuesday Walter had gone to town without explaining where he was going, and had come home before lunch smelling of a building with carpet and forced air heating. The day she had asked him over dinner where he had been, and he had said in the way Walter said things that were finished and did not require discussion in town handling something. In town handling something. He had been handling the most important thing he would ever handle. He had been ensuring that whatever happened to the farm, to the debt, to his own health, to any of the things a farmer in the late 1970s could see moving toward him from the horizon, this particular thing would be decided. His son's inheritance would be protected by something stronger than intention and more reliable than hope. It would be protected by a document properly recorded sitting in the county courthouse, where any careful person who knew to look would find it exactly as Walter had left it. Ruth held the folded photocopy in both hands and looked at it for a moment longer. Then she put it back in her coat pocket. She looked at her son. She said, "He never told me." It was not an accusation. It was not grief exactly, though grief was somewhere in it. It was the statement of a woman who had known a man for 30 years and had understood him deeply and had just discovered that even at that depth, there were things he had carried alone, not from any failure of love, but from the particular way he had been built, the way he handled the important things in silence and with precision and without requiring anyone else to carry them with him. Daniel said no, he didn't tell anyone. Ruth nodded once, the small, decisive nod that meant she had received information and integrated it and was moving forward. Then she said quietly, "He knew you'd find it." Daniel looked at his mother. He said yes, he did. They stood together outside the Harlan County sale barn in the September light for another moment. Then they walked to their separate trucks and drove home. What followed was complicated in the way that legal and financial untangling is always complicated, not dramatic, not sudden, but the long, careful work of people sorting out a situation that had not resolved the way any of the systems involved had anticipated. Helen Marsh handled the negotiations. She was in her element in situations that did not fit ordinary categories, and this one did not fit any category that Clyde Mettler or First Frontier Bank had a prepared response to. The bank held notes totaling $171,000 against a farming operation whose primary asset, the land itself, belonged to a 19-year-old who had not signed those notes and who could not be compelled to resolve them except through a negotiated arrangement that served his interests as well as the bank's. The bank, to its credit, approached this as an institution trying to resolve an unusual situation, practically, rather than as an adversary trying to extract the maximum possible from a difficult position. The loan officer who led the negotiations told Helen Marsh in a conversation she would recount years later that he had been in agricultural lending for 16 years and had never encountered a situation quite like this one. He was not complaining. He was stating a fact about the particular shape of the thing he was dealing with. The arrangement they reached after 4 months of careful negotiation was this: $96,000 of the land-related debt was restructured into a personal note held by Daniel, secured by the land he now owned outright, at a renegotiated interest rate that acknowledged the bank's limited leverage and Daniel's genuine interest in maintaining a workable relationship with the institution that held his operating financing. The remaining $75,000, the operating lines, and the additional personal loan Walter had taken for Daniel's education was addressed through the equipment sale proceeds and a partial forgiveness that the bank arrived at by calculating the cost of carrying a non-performing note against a title they had no legal claim to enforce. It was not a gift. It was arithmetic. The bank made the decision that a reasonable settlement now was worth more than an unreasonable fight over a situation the law had already decided. Daniel signed the restructured note in January of 1984. He made his first payment that same month. He made every subsequent payment on schedule without exception for 11 years. He made the final payment in the spring of 1995. He was 31 years old. He drove to the bank, sat across from the current loan officer, not Clyde Mettler, who had retired 2 years earlier, but a younger man who had inherited the file and knew its history and received the paid-off receipt the way Walter had received his in 1971. He kept a copy in the oak document box. Preston Orville practiced estate law in Harlan County for 19 more years after September 9, 1983. He became, by all accounts, significantly more thorough in his review of property records. The deed searched the complete pull of all recorded instruments against a property going back to the original filing, not just the current ownership documents, became a standard first step in every estate file his office handled, regardless of how clear the file appeared on its face. No court ordered this. No bar association reviewed his conduct. He had not made an error in any technical sense. He had worked from the documents in the estate file, and the document that changed everything had not been in the estate file. By the standards of reasonable professional practice, he had done what was expected of him. He changed his practice anyway because he was a careful man who had learned something and had no interest in learning it again the same way. He said in a conversation with a colleague that was later documented in the County Bar Association's informal case study records that the Hargrove matter was the one he returned to most often in his thinking about how estate work should be done. Not because of what happened in the sale barn, though, that was unusual enough. Because of what Walter Hargrove had done in 1978, the deed transfer arranged quietly recorded, properly filed in an envelope with a boy's name on it and placed in a document box where it would wait. He said it was the most complete piece of estate planning he had ever encountered, done by a man with no formal legal training, arrived at by a farmer who had learned once badly what happened when a document was not in the right place, and had spent the following 20 years making sure that the document that mattered most to him would be exactly where it needed to be. The neighboring farmer, the one who had wanted the South Pasture acreage for 9 years, who had dropped out of the bidding at $274,000, and then sat very still while the room processed the news that the land was not available, after all drove home on the back road that passed the end of the Hargrove farm lane. He slowed at the lane entrance. He sat there for a while, engine running, looking down the gravel toward the farmhouse and the equipment shed and the South Pasture fence line he could see in the distance. He drove away without getting out of his truck. 2 years later, in the fall of 1985, he stopped at the farmhouse and knocked on the door and asked to talk to Daniel. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour. They worked out a grazing lease arrangement on 20 acres of the South Pasture, a fair arrangement, the kind that serves both parties well enough that neither one has reason to revisit the terms. They renewed the lease every year after that. Roy Tillman called farm auctions in Nebraska for 14 more years. He retired in 1997. At every Auctioneers Association meeting he attended in those 14 years, he told the story of September 9, 1983. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a legal lesson, as a story about what a room sounds like when 61 people find out they were wrong about something at exactly the same moment. He said he had called sales for 20 years and had heard every kind of noise a crowd makes. He had heard excitement and competition and disappointment and the complex sound of a lot going for more than anyone expected, and the equally complex sound of one going for less. He said he had never heard a sound quite like the one in the Harlan County sale barn when Daniel Hargrove finished his sentence and the room understood what it had been told. Not loud, not angry, just the particular silence of a large number of people understanding something new simultaneously in a room they had entered with complete certainty about what was going to happen inside it. He said it was the quietest sound he had ever heard. Daniel Roy Hargrove is in his 60s now. He still farms the 340 acres in Harlan County, Nebraska that his grandfather filed the deed for in 1942, that his father farmed for 30 years, that have been in Daniel's sole legal ownership since a March morning in 1983, when Walter Hargrove's heart gave out, and the arrangement Walter had quietly made 5 years earlier did exactly what Walter had intended it to do. His son farms with him now, a third generation on the same 340 acres, the north fields still in wheat, the South Pasture still running cattle, the seasonal draw, and the shallow pond still reliable in most years. The oak document box that Walter built and kept is still in the farmhouse office, on the same shelf where it has always been. The original 1942 deed is in it, the 1971 paid-off receipt, the 1978 transfer deed, the 1995 paid-off receipt Daniel's own filed behind Walter's. They are not framed, they are not displayed. They sit in the box the way Walter always kept them, without ceremony, without sentiment, because they are working documents, and working documents do their job by existing and by being exactly where you can find them when you need them. Helen Marsh retired from practice in 2001. She and Daniel have stayed in touch in the way that people stay in touch when they have shared something consequential, not frequently, but with the genuine warmth of people who understand what they meant to each other at a particular moment. She attended a gathering at the farm in the early years of this century, and when someone asked her to say something about the case, she said only that Daniel Hargrove was the most prepared 19-year-old she had ever sat across a desk from, and that every bit of the credit for that belonged to his father. Walter Hargrove never said out loud what he was planning when he made that 1978 deed transfer. He did not write a letter explaining it. He did not tell Ruth. He did not tell Daniel. He made the arrangement, filed it at the courthouse, put the paperwork in an envelope with his son's name on it, placed the envelope in the document box, and continued farming. He was a farmer. He understood that the best protection you can give something you love is not a wall around it, but a foundation beneath it. Something built so quietly and so correctly that by the time anyone needs it, it has already been holding everything up for years. He built that foundation in November of 1978 on a Tuesday morning at a law office 30 miles from home. He drove back to the farm and went to work. He never mentioned it again. The land has been holding ever since. The land remembers who prepared for it.